right? But of course, physics, until the quantum level, until we get to quantum mechanics, physics doesn't have any place for the high-grade occasions. It doesn't recognize them. Physics gets all involved in studying the atoms and the molecules and so forth, and then in this little arabesque of arrogance, physicists decide that's all there is, that there are only low-grade inorganic occasions. And therefore, anything in reality which looks like anything else is probably an illusion. This is not satisfying philosophical reasoning. A good philosophy does not require us to explain away our own existence, because the whole point of philosophy is to explain our own existence to ourselves. In quantum theory, the physicists begin to realize that, in fact, reality must include something other than the inorganic. And you begin to get these strange ideas that the observer is somehow required. And then people think, well, maybe the human observer is the factor that makes things actually happen. Now, this is a bit absurd, but I will agree with the quantum physicists that it always takes a conscious decision to make anything actual. But what I will suggest, what Whitehead will suggest, and what many quantum theorists are now beginning to think, each occasion actually has the consciousness which makes it actual itself. Right? So each actual occasion makes the decisions by virtue of which it becomes actual. That has to be coordinated with quantum physics in various ways, and there's a whole project there that has to be worked out. Now, when physicists understand these inorganic occasions, they understand them in a language of mathematics. Since the late 1600s, it has been assumed that mathematics is the language of nature. But if we're going to understand nature mathematically, we have to measure it, because it's only through measurement that we can transform our experience of the world into numbers that we can manipulate mathematically. That's what measurement is, right? It's an operation which produces a number, reliably produces a number in relation to some observation. But people in our culture have not paid sufficient attention to the operation of measurement itself. How is measurement possible? And what is measurement? This is a very profound question. And it's one of the great merits of Whitehead that he devoted an enormous amount of attention to unearthing and explicating the conditions under which measurement is possible. So to make this really simple, I'll just point out that all measurement involves either a ruler or a clock. Period. Right? All measurement requires a standard. And the standards of measurement are either spatial or temporal. Right? So there are rulers, which physicists suggestively call rigid rods. And then there are clocks, which physicists call periodic oscillators. They wouldn't want to say clock because it's too ordinary. We need a technical term, right? So it's a periodic oscillator. Now, if I want to measure something in time, I compare it to the ticks of a clock. If I want to measure something in space, I take some ruler, which I take to be a standard, and I count how many times I can place the ruler against whatever it is that I'm measuring. It's very simple. And it's odd when you think about it. But even when you read a dial or look at a digital readout or anything else, it all comes down to comparisons with rulers and clocks. Now, why are rulers and clocks good for measurement? The reason is that they remain what they are. A periodic oscillator, in fact, oscillates periodically. And a ruler has to hold its length. Right? We don't use rubber bands for rulers, right? Because they won't hold their length. Right? But what are the conditions under which things can either oscillate periodically or hold a rigid length? Only if they're made up of low-grade occasions that tend to persist in their habits unless they're really disturbed. Like you could not make a ruler out of living tissue. Think about that. You can't do it. because living tissue is always adapting to the environment and won't hold still to function as a standard. So we can only do measurement with inorganic entities. And basically, measurement involves comparing inorganic entities to inorganic entities. Right? So measurement is only possible in the inorganic world. Also, and this is a little more subtle, but it's interesting, in order for measurement to work, space has to be structured in a certain way. So it's like this. If I measure this chair and I want to see if it'll fit through the front door, I have to assume that 1.5 feet over here means the same thing as 1.5 feet over there, right? That as I move in space, the definition of distance doesn't change. It does change in dreams, right? In dreams, I could measure it over here and go over there and measure it, but it wouldn't fit, right? Even though it just doesn't, because things don't hold still that way in dreams. Things hold still that way in the waking world. And the way Whitehead conceptualizes it, he says the only way measurement can work is if we imagine the whole world is pervaded by parallel lines. Right? So if there are parallel lines that will connect the width of this chair to the width of the door by parallel lines, then the measurement stays the same. In other words, measurement is only possible in a relatively Cartesian space. We can get technical about this and talk about curvature and so forth, but we won't, but to keep it simple. If we're in a space that can be structured in terms of parallel lines, measurement is possible. Otherwise, it's not. So the inorganic world is this world of low-grade occasions operating in the context of an essentially Newtonian space. That's the inorganic world. That's the physical world. And that is not the world that we actually live in. The inorganic occasions in our waking world live in that way, but we don't. Right? We aren't like that. So suppose we say, okay, there are these inorganic entities, and they do in fact form the inorganic world. And when we're awake, we're very much involved in the inorganic world. But we are not inorganic. Right? So we are actual occasions of a higher grade. In other words, we are made out of matter that is not physical matter. I am in this moment a material being. I am as real as any atom in this room. But I am nowhere in the physical world. My existence can't be measured. In my experience, there are an infinite number of things which cannot be measured. Love and beauty and joy and hatred and depression, these things cannot be measured. Hunger even cannot be measured. It's an immeasurable experience. I am not measurable. No scientist has ever discovered a living being. All they've discovered is systems of inorganic beings. But something else happens. There is something which I am. I am a material being that is not part of the physical world. I'm something else. You are something else. Right? You are actual occasions of high grade, actual, but not physical. It's a little tricky, right? Because one of the fundamental tenets of the modern world is that the physical is the actual, that everything which is actual can be measured by a physicist. In fact, if you want to know if something is real, we go to a physicist and we say, can you measure it? Can you do it? Can you find an experiment that'll prove this? You cannot prove the existence of a human being in that way. Right? We don't exist in that way. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we see that the waking world is not the same thing as the physical world, because the waking world also includes in its operations the functioning of actual occasions of higher grade. We could call this subtle matter. You know, there's one of the interesting issues that comes up, this idea of subtle matter, or what I call transphysical matter, has been around for a long time. And it was actually spoken about a great deal back in the 1890s and the early 20th century by the theosophists, some of you may have heard of, who talked about transphysical worlds and transphysical matter. But no one has been able, to my knowledge, to come up with a definition of transphysical matter that really makes sense. So the theosophists spoke about density. They said, well, solid matter is dense, liquid matter is less dense, gas is less dense, and you go on in this scale of density, moving up into this transphysical matter. That doesn't really work. It doesn't explain anything. Or people speak about higher dimensions, which also doesn't work, because whenever you have higher dimensions, you're still operating in a context of measurement, which means that what you're talking about is still physical. But what I'm suggesting here is that the difference between subtle matter and transphysical matter is in the proportion of mind, the proportion of mental activity that's involved in it. So the higher up we go in this scale, the more elaborate the interpretation, the more elaborate the decision-making, the more consciousness is involved. Once we can say that every actuality involves both consciousness and matter, that every actual occasion is a drop of experience on the inside and an event on the outside, then we can see how the proportion of the materiality and the consciousness can change. And that in certain material entities, the processing by means of which they become actual is more elaborate. There's more mind involved. And so these actualities that have more mind involved are a different kind of entity.